Mandatory vaccines have become a hot topic in South Africa. With the country in the grip of a fourth wave, some fear current vaccination campaigns may not be enough. Would it help to take away choice and make vaccines mandatory? And how should this be done? Bowmans associate lawyer Tanya Calitz joins us to discuss this further. Tanya, thank you very much for your time today. So first of all, we have to distinguish between making vaccines mandatory for the country and making it mandatory for people to access certain places. And I think it's the second option that government is discussing very seriously with some business organizations. But the question is, which of these options is likely to be more successful within a legal framework?
Good afternoon, Anli, and thank you for having me. So I think this option, government imposing a countrywide mandatory vaccine policy, that is not too likely to succeed, because there's a lot of challenges surrounding that. It's more likely that the second option, that imposing mandatory vaccine policy to enter certain public spaces, that's likely to succeed. And the reason for that is because as our constitutional rights are in play at this moment with COVID-19, Section 37 of the Constitution is very clear that no right is absolute or supreme, and that any constitutional right can be limited. And on that basis, such a mandatory vaccine policy will succeed.
So we know that some businesses, sporting and entertainment events, and some universities have already started implementing mandatory vaccine policy for those wanting to gain access to the premises. But we also have to understand wider implications. Under what conditions could an unvaccinated employee possibly be barred entry to their place of work, or perhaps even let go after refusing to vaccinate?
It becomes a bit challenging from an employment aspect. There's legislation to comply with, and I would say that difficulty with someone that's not vaccinated, of course, there's the risk of, transmitting the virus and infecting others in your team or the department where you work in. I would say that. And yes, you are quite right that universities and big companies have already imposed a mandatory workplace vaccine policy. And, the employer has the responsibility to see how it can reasonably accommodate an employee. So things such as seeing whether an employee can possibly work remotely for the foreseeable future, that would be an option. Or if an employer possibly do not want to get the vaccine, there could be other measures in place, such as having to present a negative PCR test before entering a building. But it is challenging, and employers would have to be very careful around that, and would have to comply with the Constitution and also employment legislation.
Would there be certain conditions of employment legislation that would allow people to be exempted from mandatory vaccine policy?
Yes. So I would say that if you have a pre-existing medical condition that's dangerous for you to get the vaccine, I'm not really aware of such condition, but if there's a pre-existing medical condition and you possibly have a doctor's letter, I think on that basis, an employer will be likely to grant exemption for a mandatory vaccine policy for a specific employer or employee. But it's very important that this will be assessed by a case-on-case or case-by-case basis. There's no blanket rule that will apply to all employees.
Obviously, citizens can't be barred from accessing essential services such as, for instance, healthcare. But in terms of just the employment sphere, there are some complex situations, and I want to use a hypothetical example. For instance, let's say government imposes mandatory vaccines for employees at a state facility, let's say, for instance, Eskom. So those employees have to be vaccinated in order to work physically on the premises, and that would no doubt include, for instance, the Client Services Centre. But would the same apply to South African citizens wanting to go into those offices to resolve a query? Would they have to be vaccinated? How are we going to approach these complex situations from a labour law perspective?
I think employment law has its own challenges and complexities that require compliance. But I would think that an employee at Eskom would not necessarily be seen or treated on the same basis as someone from the public just entering the building, having an inquiry. But what we do know is we've seen now that COVID is so serious and that, individual rights, yes, it's important. And yes, there are a host of constitutional rights. But where we're at currently, it's very clear that the rights of the public, that of society at large, the greater good, it really trumps your individual rights. And on that basis, companies and employers can enforce mandatory vaccine policies. And they can even go so far to say, if you want to go enter into Eskom's building, you need to be vaccinated. And they would, there's not a lot of, such a challenge or, it will definitely succeed in the courts.
Can we expect in the near future, once these mandatory vaccine policies start being enforced practically, I know a lot of universities have said that they will only be implemented from January onwards. Once that kind of happens in a broader public sphere, can we expect to see a lot of legal challenges happening? And what would that do to a court system that's already facing major backlogs as a result of COVID-19?
Yes, Annie, that's a very good point. And yes, we can definitely, there's going to be a floodgate of court cases and litigation going around with compulsory vaccine policies. But an important thing to note is universities such as, I'm thinking of University of Free State, that has recently introduced a mandatory vaccine policy. There's always, it's not just a clear-cut get the vaccine or you can't enter the university premises. There's always other options and how the employer or the university in this instance carefully see how they can accommodate someone by, for UFS, for instance, saying that if you want to access Koffsie's ground, you need to present a negative PCR test. So it will never be a case of a clear-cut, get the vaccine or you will be cut off from society. There will be other measures in place. And going back to your point around the court system and the courts, yes, it's. I think once one court is, or one case is heard in the court will set a precedent, and that will be used in cases going forward with similar facts. So yes, but there will definitely be a lot of challenges in the court. But as I said, just looking at the seriousness of COVID, such a challenge will really will succeed in the court of imposing mandatory vaccines.
Thank you very much for your insights. That was lawyer and human rights activist Tanya Calitz speaking to us about the possible legal success of enforcing mandatory vaccines.